What are you referring to specifically when you're referring to the spirit?
I'm referring to what
The
the Bible
mind?
calls the breath of life. And this is, as I mentioned before, this is the spiritual aspect of the individual that interacts with the spiritual world, that receives spiritual information, that imparts power to the body and controls the body's actions.
Would you call these the higher powers
Yeah. Uh-huh.
in the same relation that is brought in comparison to the lower powers?
Right. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the higher powers of the mind are always have their origin in the spirit, and the lower powers of the mind, you're going to find its origin in the body, because it has to do with chemicals and the chemical milieu and how you feel about certain things and the signals that come from the body to the mind and so on.
Another question. I know this is completely off topic. In light of what most people believe about the state of man in death, that breath of life goes back to God.
Yes.
Most people say that is the spirit and that is the person.
Because they think that the spirit is the person rather than recognizing that the soul is the person. And the soul is a combination of the body and the spirit. That's the person, is the combination of the body and the spirit. The spirit is a component of the soul, just as the body is a component of the soul. But you cannot have a functioning soul without having the spirit, without having the body. When we think of it, let's just take a physical thing because that's what we relate to easily. The liver is a component of the body. The kidneys are a component of the body. The heart and the lungs are different components of the body. The heart is not the lungs. The heart is not the kidneys. The heart is not the liver. And each of them have different parts of the overall function of the body. And when you put it together, the heart doesn't stop being the heart, and the liver doesn't stop being the liver, and so on and so forth. But if you take out the component of the liver, you're going to die. If you take out the component of the kidneys, you're going to die. If you take out the component of the heart, you're going to die. If you take out the component of the lungs, you're going to die. The system, its function, is dependent upon every integral component of that system. And so you are a soul, which has two main components, the spirit and the body. And so if you separate those components, then you have nothing to continue functioning. So there's no continued thought, there's no continued consciousness, there's no continued life, there's no continued anything when they're separated.
Yeah. So if there's nothing continuing with the spirit, what does it mean then that the spirit goes back to God?
It's a good question. And is there a very real but spiritual substance that's there? I don't know. That returns to God. That's some kind of spiritual substance? I don't know. Is it the idea that the information that that spirit utilized is in God's consciousness, and he remembers all that information, and so he knows how to put all that information back together again when he reforms the individual with the new body and so on and so forth? Yeah, could be. I don't have all the answers to that. But I do know from Revelation, what God has revealed to us is that we do have body, we do have spirit, and they only function when they're together. They don't function when they're separate. And so there's no spirit going off with memories and thoughts and feelings and all that kind of stuff and existing somewhere with some consciousness and awareness of what's going on. Even from a computer standpoint, if you don't have any hardware, you really don't have software, because the software only exists in the context of the hardware.
Right.
I mean, it is a separate component. It is the controlling component of the hardware, but somewhere there's hardware in order for the software to operate through. And if you took away all hardware everywhere, there would be no more software. And I would say that the electrical current is the effect of the spirit. It's not the spirit because it's physical, because you can measure it with physical devices and so on. So it's actually, the electrical current is actually part of the body. It's not actually part of the spirit, but it's the effect of the action of the spirit upon the body.
When the Bible says, it's the breath of life, that's one thing. But then we add consciousness, thoughts, spiritual needs, judgment. We add all of these things, and then that breath of life becomes
Yes.
much more.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's like the difference between dust and the body. The dust and the body are made of the same elements, but the dust is very simple and the body is very complex. And when there was that breathing of life into that dusty frame, it turned into a very complex, organized, structural, functional body that had the same components, but was in a much more complex functional structure than what it was made from. And as Ellen White says, as in the physical, so in the spiritual. And so I see the same thing, where yes, there was the breath of life, which might be perceived as simple, although I'm not sure how simple it really is, because we're talking about things that we can't necessarily comprehend. But that simple breath of life became a very complex, organized, functioning spirit in man, created by God and organized by him, and so on.
So when Jesus said, "Into thy hands I commence my spirit," was that more than the breath? Would that include who Jesus was?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, it would include his soul. He was committing to God his very existence and the potential for that existence in the future. Again, sometimes the terminology it's difficult, even in Spirit of Prophecy, when you read through there, and even in the Bible. There's different terms that are used to describe the same thing, and so from a terminology standpoint, it gets a little muddy. So that's why it's important for us to define what we're talking about, and so on. And even after trying to define now, and even then I'm saying, okay, well, I'm talking about the spirit, but I'm actually really talking about the mind, because while these might be components of function that come through the spirit, yet it can't function without being with the body and the brain, and so on. So as everything else in creation that functions according to the fundamental law, and the fundamental law is taking to give, so it must be true that every component of everything that functions also functions by that fundamental law of taking to give. And so it's the spirit itself that must take and has an input and has an output where it must give. And at the taking side is the cause, and at the giving side, at the exit, is the effect. Now, the spirit is dependent. It has needs that must be supplied from outside of itself. The spirit is dependent. Everything in creation is dependent. The only thing that is independent, that does not have needs, is God himself. And the spirit is active, it's not passive. So the spirit must actively take into itself for itself. And it must actively give from itself for something else. It cannot be passively filled from the outside. And that's something different than the body. That's something different than the physical. The physical can be passively filled. It can be there. You can hook up an IV to it, and then you can start flowing fluid into those blood vessels, and it doesn't have to actively take. The spirit does. And the spirit must actively give. And the spirit is internally self-governing, so it controls itself from the inside. It cannot be controlled from the outside.